In 1893, a nugget of over 70% pure copper that weighed over 600 pounds was displayed at the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition. It had come out of Grand Canyon, more specifically from the Last Chance mine on Horseshoe Mesa below Grandview Point. For 6 days, 6 men labored to haul the giant nugget 3.5 miles up the trail, a trail that, near the top, was made up of logs chained to the cliff face. Hello and welcome to Canyon Whispers. I'm your host, Rebecca. This was originally going to be my first episode, but then I heard that Grand Canyon Lodge had burned down, so I put together an episode about its history and released that instead. Please check it out if you haven't already. The subjects of this episode are the Last Chance mine on Horseshoe Mesa, the hotels on Grandview Point, and the man they had in common. The copper nugget was awarded first prize in its category at the exposition, and was later sold to the Chicago Field Museum for $1 per pound. One of the men who got a share of that money was Pete Berry, a man who had originally come to Arizona in 1887 to avenge his brother's death. Born in Cedar Falls, Iowa in 1858, Pete was the youngest of 8 children. The family moved to Missouri while he was still a child. Then in 1879, he and his brother John decided to try their luck in the brand new mining town of Pitkin, Colorado. But after 4 years, John moved on to Flagstaff, Arizona, where he opened the San Juan Saloon on Railroad Avenue, right across from the train depot. Railroad Avenue is now part of Route 66. One night in January of 1887, a fight broke out in the saloon. Brothers George and William Hawks pistol-whipped another cowboy because they thought he had been singing too loudly all evening. Some other guys grabbed the 2 men while John Barry attempted to wrestle the pistol away from George. It went off, and the bullet hit John in the abdomen. He died early the next morning. Word was sent to Pete in Colorado, and he immediately set out for Flagstaff. By the time he arrived, the Hawks brothers were already dead. Not long after they had been arrested, a group of about 20 men had forced their way into the jail and carried out their own justice. So Pete Berry took over the San Juan Saloon and married his brother's widow, May. But after the saloon burned down during Flagstaff's July 1888 fire, he turned to prospecting in Grand Canyon with another pair of brothers, Ralph and Niles Cameron. He filed a mining claim at Grandview Point and built a small cabin there so that he would have a place to stay while he was on prospecting trips. In April of 1890, almost a year after the birth of his son Ralph, Pete discovered copper deposits 2,500 feet below Grandview Point on Horseshoe Mesa. The Cameron brothers showed an interest in becoming partners with him in a mine, and the 3 men soon found 3 other partners: Ed Gale, Robert Ferguson, who was later kicked out of the partnership for laziness, and a local rancher, Thomas McMillan, who put up the majority of the money for the project. The partners then proceeded to make multiple small claims in the area over the next 2 years until Ralph Cameron finally struck the bonanza on June 3, 1892. Barry wrote in his journal that they worked on it all day and, at 4 p.m., we were ragged-assed millionaires. Apparently they got away from the vein after that, though, because then he wrote, at 6 p.m., no millionaire, but ragged-assed all the same. Fortunately for them, they later got back on track because the vein that Ralph had dug into was high-grade copper sulfide ore, containing 37% copper. This would become the Last Chance mine. The following month, the men began building a trail for easier access between the rim and the mesa. Over the next 7 months, they worked all day, 6 days a week, finally finishing sometime in February of 1893. Most of this trail is part of the modern-day Grandview Trail, but thankfully that doesn't include the sketchy part near the top. But the original trail got a lot of use. Every day, anywhere from 8 to 10 mules and/or burros would make 1.5 round trips, each carrying up to 200 pounds. So, for example, one day they would carry supplies down to the mesa, then carry copper ore out of the canyon to be loaded onto wagons, Then they would go back down to the mesa, then the next day they would haul out more ore, then go back down to get another load, then back up to the rim again. The wagons, meanwhile, were driven south to Flagstaff every day, where the ore would be put on a train and shipped to a smelter in El Paso, Texas. This part would become easier once the railroad arrived at the canyon in late 1901, turning a 73-mile trip, which had to be split into 2 days, into a 14-mile trip that probably only took about 3 hours. In 1895, Pete Berry and the Cameron brothers bought out their remaining two partners and formed the Grand Canyon Copper Company. They hired men to work the mine, paying them about $5 a day. And over the next 7 years, the company would ship out 140 railcar loads of copper ore. By the time of the mining company formation, Pete's personal life had taken a hit. In the fall of 1893, May had run off to Tucson with another man, taking little Ralph with her. Their divorce was finalized the following spring. Fortunately, Pete had projects to keep his mind off things. He had noticed tourism picking up at the canyon and saw the potential for another avenue of income. So he began building a 2-story lodge of mud-chinked ponderosa pine logs with a gable roof. He only bothered putting in windows on the side that overlooked the rim, though. The second floor was made of planks, but the first floor was dirt. By the time it was ready to open in 1897, it not only had rooms for people to sleep in, and a dining room, but also a saloon, blacksmith shop, storage sheds, and a space for doing the laundry. The Grandview Hotel was advertised as the only first-class hotel at Grand Canyon. That may sound like a bold claim for a place with dirt floors, but compared to their competition at the time, it was probably a fairly accurate statement. Bass Camp, Hance Ranch, Bright Angel Hotel, and Cameron's Hotel and Camps were all basic frame hotels, tent cabins, and/or simple canvas tents. The Grandview Hotel stood out, not only because it was the only log structure, but because Pete had opted to decorate with native crafts such as Hopi baskets and Navajo blankets. And it was also one of the first establishments that tourists came to when visiting the canyon, thanks to the Grandview Stage Road being the main route to the South Rim at the time. It led directly from Flagstaff to Grandview Point. Fun fact, the road still partially exists today as Forest Road 310. You can reach it by following Forest Road 302 east out of Tucson. Pete charged his guests $2 per night, equivalent to about $77 today. And this did include meals. But he charged an additional cost for anyone who wanted to take a Surrey tour along the rim or a mule or horse ride on the Grandview, Hance, or Tanner trails. The railroad coming to Grand Canyon in 1901 was a bit of a double-edged sword for Pete Berry. It may have made his mining operation easier, but it also drew tourists away from Grandview Point to Grand Canyon Village. So he began offering free transportation from the train depot to his hotel. One of the last tourists to come directly to Grandview Point was Martha Thompson, who arrived sometime in 1900, and she liked it so much that she decided to stay, hiring on as a housekeeper at the Grandview Hotel. In 1902, the mine, trails, mill site, and Pete's Hotel were sold to the similarly named Canyon Copper Company. Also around this time, another trail was built. It dropped into the canyon about a mile northwest of the trailhead to the mine. This trail connects to the lower part of the original trail, and it's the one that hikers use today. I, for one, am glad we're not still using the logs chained to the cliff. The new owners expanded mine operations over the next 5 years by digging new shafts and building new structures on Horseshoe Mesa alongside the existing corrals, tent cabins, kitchen, and blacksmith shop. And around 1905, they even considered putting in an electric tramway as an easier form of transportation between the rim and the mesa. But to do so, they would have had to put a dam across Cottonwood Creek, on the west side of the mesa, to generate the electricity, and they weren't sure that the dam would be able to hold up under flash floods. In the meantime, Pete had used his share of the sale profit to build a second hotel on his 160-acre homestead. It opened in 1903 as the Summit Hotel. This one was a frame structure and was less rustic than the Grandview Hotel. It had steam heat in every room, pure spring water, baths, huge fireplaces, a library, and even a post office. Advertising brochures also made claims of good beds, excellent meals, and unlimited views of the canyon, forest, and the distant painted desert. Pete and Martha also got married in August of that year, much to the surprise of their friends, apparently. After a few months, the Canyon Copper Company also offered to buy the Summit Hotel, and Pete agreed. They kept him on as a trail guide, and Martha remained the head cook and housekeeper. But when El Tovar opened in 1905, the competition became a lot harder, and the hotels at Grandview Point began to flounder. Then in 1907, copper prices crashed from 24.5 cents per pound to just 12.5 cents. And despite having shipped $100,000 worth of ore, about $3,420,000 in today's money, their expenses were already exceeding their income. And so the Last Chance mine was closed, followed shortly by the hotels. The Berries remained on their homestead, however, and in 1911 they tried reopening the hotels, but that wasn't financially stable for long. So then they attempted to start their own town in hopes that it would rival Grand Canyon Village. They were going to call it Summit. They subdivided their land and offered a free lot to anyone who would build a house, but no one took them up on their offer. So with debts mounting, they sold their entire homestead in 1913 to none other than William Randolph Hearst, the millionaire newspaperman. Pete also helped arrange the sale of the hotels, mine, and mill sites to Hearst, who paid a total of $74,236.64, which today would be over $2,410,000. With the money from the homestead sale, and whatever percentage of the rest that Pete may have gotten, the Berries bought themselves a car, probably their first, and they bought a ranch in the nearby Coconino Basin for Pete's son, Ralph. Hearst did not attempt to reopen the mine or the hotels, but he kept the Berries on as caretakers of the property nonetheless. And despite leading the Forest Service, and later the Park Service, to believe that he was going to make huge developments on his 200 acres of prime real estate, Hearst never did anything except graze cattle. He rarely even visited. The only change he made was to tear down the Grandview Hotel in 1929. 13 years prior to that, Pete and Martha had decided, for whatever reason, to leave the canyon and retire to San Gabriel, California. But at the end of February 1919, Ralph Berry caught the Spanish flu and died within a week. He had been just a couple months shy of his 30th birthday. Fortunately, Pete was able to make it back to Arizona to be at his son's side when he passed. Ralph was buried in the Grand Canyon Pioneer Cemetery, and his father and stepmother moved into his ranch, quietly living out their lives until Martha died in January of 1931. Pete buried her next to his son, then joined them in September of the following year after losing the battle with stomach cancer. In 1939, the Park Service finally grew tired of Hearst's threats of development, even though he had never followed through. And they invoked an old law that basically allowed the government to seize any private property inside federal lands as they saw fit. This made Hearst mad, and he sent his lawyers into legal battle. He also went to work at getting the local press on his side. At best, newspapers called it a Park Service land grab, and at worst, Nazism and Russian tactics of the lowest denominator. So the Park Service agreed to pay for the property, but they said it was only worth $25,000. Hearst called BS and said they'd better pay him $367,000. A federal judge stepped in and said, "Tell you what, how about they pay you $85,000?" Except it wasn't actually a question. So by 1941, the Park Service owned all the property above and below the rim. They left the Horseshoe Mesa site as it was, allowing nature to take over again. But for some reason, they waited until 1959 to tear down the remaining buildings on the rim. 8 years before that, in 1951, a Harvard professor was doing a survey on the uranium content of copper deposits in the Southwest for the Atomic Energy Commission. And of all the places he studied, this mine had the largest concentration of uranium. Which is why, when you hike the Grandview Trail down to Horseshoe Mesa, you will see a lovely little radiation warning sign as you pass near the entrance to one of the old mine shafts. As of 1965, there was only one stone structure remaining on the mesa, as well as the remnants of several tent cabins. The entrances to the mine were still plainly visible, and there were many mining implements laying around. But by 1990, All the entrances were blocked by debris. Only a couple pieces of machinery remained, and the tent cabins were completely gone. Only the stone structure was still standing. So if you hike down to Horseshoe Mesa today, the first evidence of the mine you will come across is the entrance to one of the shafts. It's at the top of a hill to the right of the trail, but the entrance is blocked. In 2009, all entrances to the mine were fitted with gates to keep out wayward tourists. There were a few reasons for this, one being the possible radiation factor, we mustn't forget that. Another is the fact that this particular shaft is about 60 feet deep and the Park Service doesn't want people falling in, which is fair. They already have enough people to rescue. There are also bats who are using the tunnels for roosting and they don't want them disturbed. And they're just trying to preserve the tunnels as a sort of time capsule, since the miners literally just dropped their tools and left, never to return. There's still stuff to be seen on the surface, though, like the stone structure that I previously mentioned, and an old winch, at least I think that's what it is, which you can find by following the trail towards Page Spring for a short distance. And by the way, if you do that, you'll be crossing right over the top of the main tunnel, which runs about 300 feet back from the cliff face to where it joins the shaft that I was talking about. Remnants of the Grandview Hotel can also still be seen. How is that possible if it was torn down in 1929? Well, some of the logs were donated to the construction of Desert View Watchtower. So when you enter the Kiva room and see the log ceiling, you're looking at part of the old Grandview Hotel. Well, that wraps up this episode. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll be back for the next one. In the meantime, please check out my social links in the description.